Hi, and welcome to this talk for the Aristotelian Society Open Session on Kant, Quantifiers, and Numerical Cognition. My name is Nick Currie. I'm a final year PhD at University College London, and I'm working on Kant's philosophy of logic. I think this is a really interesting topic for a couple of reasons. One, I think understanding Kant's philosophy of logic is probably the key to unlocking some important insights into Kant's theory of cognition, which is really fundamental to his theoretical philosophy as a whole. But also I think that Kant's highly unusual views about logic might have some bearing on contemporary debates in the philosophy of logic. The purpose of this talk is to present a puzzle, as I see it, about some of the things that Kant says about the nature of logic and the use that he makes of logic within the first critique, and to consider a fairly intuitive solution to that puzzle, which ultimately then I want to say doesn't work. So it's a negative outcome from the talk, but it's a worthwhile project insofar as this is, I think, a really natural way of reading the solution to the problem, and it just doesn't work. So that leaves us with a deeper problem, which is how to explain the phenomenon in question. The outline for the talk is as follows. I'm first going to present the puzzle after doing a bit of reframing, and then I'm going to consider the solution as I see it, which I call the objectual solution. And then I'm going to present the argument against that solution, say why that position can't be the right one. So, like I just mentioned, Kant's theory of cognition is very fundamental to the first critique. Cognition, in the sense that I'm going to be concerned with here, really has to be distinguished from another sense of cognition, which Kant sometimes refers to. Cognitions, in one sense for Kant, are just any objective perceptions. So in some sense, concepts and intuitions on their own constitute cognitions. But I'm really interested in this thicker notion of cognition as a unification of both a concept, conceptual content, and intuitive content. There's been a lot of great work on this in recent years. I cite just some of it here, which argues for this idea that the sort of proper notion of cognition in play for Kant is this second one, this idea of a unification of conceptual and intuitive content. So I'm going to be thinking of a cognition in what follows as a mental state in which we think an object through concepts, which are given, the object is given via intuitions. So this ties into Kant's kind of a faculty dualism, we might call it. Sort of at the heart of his theory of cognition is this idea that cognition is made up of two parts, and these two parts are deriving from two really quite fundamentally different faculties. So on the one hand, we have a faculty associated with a mental activity, thinking, which thinks by means of a certain kind of mental representation, namely concepts, and that's the understanding, sometimes thought of as a discursive faculty. And then we have this other faculty of sensibility, which has the mental activity of receiving a certain kind of content, which is this mental representation of the other kind, intuitions. So Kant sometimes calls these the two fundamental sources of the mind. Each of them is a hylomorphic compound of a pure, that's to say, non-empirical form and some kind of matter, or content, as Kant sometimes calls it. So famously, forms of sensibility are space and time. The material content of sensibility is sensation. Roughly, this is the idea that we're given sensible content, which is structured in a formal way, spatiotemporally. Things are slightly more complicated with the form of the understanding. We have kind of two things going on here. We have, on the one hand, the same kind of hylomorphic contrast. We have the pure form of thinking and the content of thinking, or usually Kant calls it the content of cognition. But we have another distinction which has to be drawn, which is kind of really fundamental to what the understanding on its own contributes to cognition. And that's this idea of a certain kind of aspect of the content of cognition, which is pure, which derives from the understanding alone. And that's the idea of the pure thought of an object in general. This is to be distinguished from empirical content, which is thought about a sensibly given object. So insofar as we can separate out these two aspects of a cognition, which are contributed by the pure understanding, the pure form of thinking on the one hand, and the pure content involved in the pure thought of an object in general, we have two correspondingly distinct sciences. We have, on the one hand, the study of the pure form of thinking, which is the responsibility of what Kant calls pure general logic, but is in fact syllogistic logic, understood in a distinctive way. And we also have transcendental logic, which is concerned with this pure content, identifying the pure thought of an object in general. Importantly, especially in the case of the pure form of thinking and syllogistic logic, we're thinking about the understanding, Kant thinks, in entire abstraction from everything both formal, intuitive, and sensible. So away from anything to do with the forms of space and time and anything that might be given in intuition. We're somehow considering the contribution understanding makes in a very isolated sense. One question I think any person who knows anything about logic in the contemporary context might wonder about this is, what does it mean to talk about syllogistic logic, which we think of as essentially concerned with defining a relation of deductive validity as characterizing a mental faculty. The connection between these two things, on the one hand, syllogistic logical theory, and on the other hand, the form of thinking and the form of the understanding. Generally, the way in which Kant sort of connects these two things up is he talks about, he doesn't directly do this, obviously, but it's sort of, I think it's clear from his lectures on logic that syllogistic consequence comes about as a product of, induced by, as I got here, certain formal features of the distinctive aspects of the understanding. So we have the mental representations, concepts, and then we have the compounds of those things, judgments, and somehow the formal features of concepts and judgments ultimately get us syllogistic consequence. Obviously, that's, I think, a very general characterization. Doesn't tell us an enormous amount. I think most people, for that reason, will agree with it who are working on this material. But crucially, the interesting interpretive questions come from what Kant means by saying formal features of concepts and judgments, but also what it means to say that the consequence relation is induced by those features. Okay, this brings us to the puzzle. The puzzle concerns what Kant calls the table of judgments. This is something that Kant thinks is the product of logic. It's the product of the work of the logicians. That's slightly complicated in various ways, which I'll come to in a moment. But the idea here is that somehow, by looking at logic textbooks, syllogistic logic textbooks of the early modern period, we find various different distinctions, which are probably logical distinctions and which form up this table in a sense. Why is this important? Well, because the table of judgments stands in a very important relationship to the table of categories. And the categories, the pure concepts, the understanding, are really fundamental to that other aspect of the pure understanding, the pure content of a thought in general, of an object in general. And so our ability to identify the table of categories is really important because we want to know what those aspects of the pure thought of an object in general are, the pure content in our thought about anything, which is intellectual. The table of judgments is able to play a special kind of role in helping us identify a table of categories for two reasons. One is that it's itself finished and complete. So this is a very famous thing that Kant says. It's very controversial what he means by it and whether or not it's a viable hypothesis. But I'm not going to try and answer that now. It's a very big question, but here's a brief sketch of what might be going on, I think is plausible. The basic idea is that syllogistic logic has the characteristics of what Kant calls a strict a priori science at various other points. That is, all of the parts of the science are connected in the right kind of way, what I call here connectivity. And each of the parts are non-redundant. So there's no redundant aspect of the whole. Everything's connected and everything's sort of essential to the whole. In the case of syllogistic logic, the idea here, I think, is simply we can see everything's connected, and we can see, because there's not that much stuff here, that there's nothing missing. So that means it's a great basis for deriving something else that we want to think of as systematically unified in the appropriate way and not just jumbled together. And it's especially good in this case because, as Kant says, the very same actions through which the understanding brings logical form to judgment, into concepts, brings a transcendental content into its representations. So there's also this connection between what logic teaches us about the form of thinking and the pure content itself. And so we're able to use the table of judgments as a guiding thread for determining the table of categories in what's called the metaphysical deduction. The thing that makes things slightly complicated here, as I mentioned before, is not everything in the table is actually from syllogistic logic. So Kant is clear that infinite judgments and singular judgments are actually derived from transcendental logic, which is concerned with the pure content part. And also there's something slightly complicated about the modalities of judgments, which is just to distinguish them enough from the others that they're not properly to be understood in the same sort of way. Singular and infinite judgments shouldn't trouble us too much because the idea here, I think, is simply we take a logical form and then we take some aspect of the pure content of a thought of an object in general, and somehow the two coming together get us something which is nonetheless native to the pure understanding as the pure understanding, but which isn't just logical. Okay, anyway, the reason this is really important for us is that we can kind of strip all that other stuff away and we're left with the core logical part of the table. This is the core logical part, and that it derives from syllogistic logic should not surprise us, for the obvious reason that from just these distinctions, we can get everything we need for the syllogism. So if we combine the quality moments and the quantity moments here, the four possible combinations get us the four logical constants of the categorical syllogistic, all, some not, and no. And also we get the propositional connectives from the relation moments. We get something like a conditional from hypothetical and something like a disjunction from the disjunctive. So for this reason, there's not a huge puzzle about why we would find the quantities in the table, because as is clear from this, they're needed to specify the constants. But there is also something slightly puzzling about their inclusion. And the reason for this is that Kant is very clear that, by and large, that quantity is a mathematical notion, and that mathematical cognitions are cognitions of space and time. So they're fundamentally synthetic a priori cognitions because they connect up with the pure forms of sensibility, which, of course, are on the other half of the cognitive divide. So it's slightly odd that we should find in the inventory of aspects of the form of thinking something that looks like it pertains to sensibility, the form of sensibility. It's also slightly strange for an historical reason, which is that Kant, who was heavily influenced by Johann Heinrich Lambert, we find in Lambert's work a characterization of logic as formal in his Anlage zur Architektonik, and we also find there what looks like everything from the table set out very clearly, but there, in a book that Kant almost certainly would have read, we find the quantities described as arithmetical. So I just think this is really weird, and I think more people should think it's weird. And so I think we need an answer to why we get this kind of thing going on here. In order to answer that question, we need to fundamentally answer the two central questions about Kant's logic. On the one hand, what does he mean when he says that logic abstracts from the content of cognition? More specifically, how total should we think of that abstraction as being? And secondly, and relatedly, what does Kant mean when he says that logic is formal? What is this form of thinking supposed to be? And how does this relate to the logical forms of concepts, judgments, and also inferences? I think if we answer these questions, we will be able to tell why something called logical quantities are included in the table, and only then. Okay, so what is the objectualist solution? Well, the objectualist solution adopts, I think, a fairly intuitive way of thinking about what Kant thinks logic studies, and ultimately is able then to answer this question of why we find the quantities in the table, and also to some extent give some kind of gloss on why that would be different from mathematical cognition. Basically, the solution is to say, well, look, what Kant is thinking of here as logic is something like the semantic conception we have of first order logical consequence. Or semantic conception of syllogistic consequence understood in a way that's analogous to first order logic. This view, it's not explicitly described as such, has been defended by Joachim Lou Adler in various places, who's a very prominent interpreter of Kant's logic, and also Melissa Merritt in a couple of places. Robert Hanna in an earlier book also, I think, defends something very similar. Basic idea is we think about the logical forms of concepts as the fact that they're representations of objectual extensions. So when we think about concepts in our logical context, we're really just concerned with representations of objectual extensions. When we think about judgments in a logical context, all we're thinking about really is certain sorts of truth-apt claims about relations between objectual extensions. And then when it comes to the inferences, we think of these as necessary truth-preserving deductions. We end up, if we adopt the objectualist picture of Kant's logic, with the following answers to the questions I proposed before. What does it mean to say logic is abstract? Well, it abstracts from the content of cognition in the sense that it concerns itself merely with topic-neutral aspects of thought. To make that slightly more precise, we might adopt a kind of more Tarskian way of thinking here and say, well, really it studies the features of thoughts about objects which reflect the permutation in invariant aspects of any given domain. And this gives us an obvious sense in which logic is formal. It concerns itself with the general schematic features of thought about objects. And then the logical form of representations are the corresponding aspects of that thinking as outlined here. Okay, so what does it then mean to talk about quantifiers in logic? Well, we end up with a fairly obvious and intuitive way of thinking about them. The form of a universal affirmative judgment it's sort of like a thought, a representation of a way that extensions can be related to one another. So if I think all f is g, what I'm doing is I'm representing in thought that the extension of the concept f is a subset of the extension of the concept g, and I'm assuming that extension of f is non-empty. In the particular case, I'm representing in thought that the extension of the concept f and the extension of the concept g, there's something that they have in common. There are some things that they share, and so on. This, I think, is obviously a quantificational reading because we're able to think of all some no and some not in the way that we would expect to think about them, which is to say that we're able to think of them as saying something about all the things, some of the things, none of the things, and so on. It's also nice because we're able to say, well, look, it looks a lot like what we think of in classical first-order logics, or even any first-order logics, as what quantities are about, really. If we think of the formulations I've given here, the set theoretic formulations, as something like the interpretations for a first-order language or the semantic clauses for a first-order language, they'll make these sentences here true. These first-order logical sentences. So we can think of Kantian logical quantities as reflecting ways of representing extensional facts that can also be expressed in first-order logical languages. And this also has the added advantage of saying, well, look, quantity here fulfills a similar representational function in thought for Kant as do the quantifier expressions in a first-order logical language. So we're not making Kant's view of logical quantity the same as ours, because obviously he's thinking about thought, and we generally think about it in terms of formal languages, but there's just this nice way of being able to think of these two as somehow closely kind of conceptually connected. How does this differ from mathematical quantity? I think the idea here, although it's very rarely discussed in these contexts, is something like, well, we're not really dealing with any kind of cognition of any particular objects, and we're not dealing with any kind of specific numbers. What we're dealing with something more general than that. It's just very highly general features of thought about objects, and so somehow that's supposed to be a kind of non-mathematical generality. Okay, why is objectualism untenable? To explain why I think this position is unworkable, I'm just going to use this notion of a mathematical alien, which is a Kantian discursive cognizer. Right? So they have to have forms of thinking and forms of intuition, and also have to content given to them in some way. But they're a discursive cognizer with the same forms of thinking, but different forms of intuition. And we can use this kind of idea with the kind of license of Kant, because he actually talks about the possibility of this. He makes it sort of open as an epistemic possibility that there could be such things. So we're just going to imagine such a thing, and then we're going to see, using that thing, if we can put some pressure on the objectualist. What can we say about the mathematical alien? Well, they're a kind of odd thing, right, to try and imagine, because they would be a creature which is the synthetic a priori claims of geometry, algebra, and arithmetic would not be valid for. In fact, I think they'd probably be inconceivable for them. So this is a thing that both has our logic and our way of thinking, but doesn't share our mathematical cognition. Okay, so how do we use this notion of mathematical alien to test objectualism? Well, we can use it to test any view about Kantian logical quantity in the following way. We can say, look, if this view of logical quantity is correct, could the mathematical alien draw the distinctions necessary to distinguish universal from particular judgments in the way that this interpretation says they would have to? So for the objectualist position, we can say, we can ask whether the mathematical alien can draw the distinctions I just mentioned in the last section between relations between extensions and so forth. Okay. Objectualism will fail this test I'm going to show in a second. Just to sort of set the stage, I'm just going to present something which is very useful for this, which Dummett makes mention of in his 1991 paper, referenced here, which is just, Dummett observed something about standard semantic, the approach to standard semantics for first order languages and their quantifier expressions, which is that In any case where we're providing such a semantics, we must presuppose a relation of identity defined over the domain. And this holds even in cases where the language lacks an identity sign. Why is this? Well, in order to give an interpretation for such a language, we have to specify elements of the domain. We have to talk about relationships between aspects of the domain, so subset relations and so forth, in a meta-language. And unless we presuppose a relation of identity defined over that domain, we'll have no way of knowing whether the two terms in the meta-language pick out the same element. And so we just won't be able to tell whether the sentence in question is true or false. So it will be a useless interpretation. And by extension, we won't be able to define semantic consequence for that language. We can use Dummett's observation here to make more precise what the objectualist is committed to with regards to the mathematical alien. So we already know that they're going to have to say that mathematical alien is able to think about conceptual extensions as standing in relations like the subset relation, and be able to think about permutation invariant connections between such relations. What Dummett's observation reveals is they will also need to be able to do something else. That is, they will need to be able to think of the elements of an underlying domain as numerically distinct. So we'll need to think about the things in the extensions as numerically distinct from one another. This is not a surprising thing for them to think, given what they've said about what Kant thinks is going on in logic, but we can make it more precise now by saying, I'll call this position discursive numerosity, and we'll say a mathematical alien for the objectualist has to have the capacity to think of an object as numerically distinct from another. Okay, so I think the problem with this commitment is it just shows that objectualism cannot be the right view about Kant's logic. And this is because Kant is clear in a number of different ways, in a number of different contexts with regards to a number of different fields, that mathematical cognition, and specifically cognition of numerical difference and identity, depends on space and time. And so also cognition of collections of discrete particular things depends on formal intuitive ground of difference. There's an enormous amount that one could say about this. There's an enormous amount that's been written about Kant's philosophy of mathematics and his philosophy of arithmetic. I'm not going to go into that now because I haven't got the time, but I've mentioned a few excellent papers by Daniel Sutherland, which I think make very clear that the extent to which Kant thinks that numerical identity and difference is dependent on space and time in this way. What I'm going to do is just look at Kant's amphibole chapter, where I think he draws a very clear contrast between the discursive and the intuitive with regards to Leibniz. And I'm going to say this gives us really good evidence that he thinks that we could be very misled if we didn't take this distinction very seriously. So in the amphibole chapter, he does a lot of things, but one of the things he does is he talks about Leibniz's commitment to the identity of indiscernibles. The idea that Kant's making, the idea he has here is just basically that when Leibniz is sort of getting lost in thinking about concepts and thinking about the relationships between concepts, and to some extent thinking that he can derive certain sorts of results from considering just discursive representations, he loses sight of the fact that the ground of numerical difference of an object doesn't lie in discursive representation. It lies in different places, so discrete locations in space and time. It requires a formal intuitive ground of difference. So if we want to represent numerical identity and difference, we need the forms of space and time. Leibniz's failure to distinguish this means that he takes what Kant conspicuously calls logical reflection, which is looking like it compares just aspects of the discursive half of our representational capacities, as though it can give us insight into something that requires the representational resources of the formal intuitive aspect of our cognition. And I think the objectualist clearly makes a similar mistake, which is that they think that when Kant's talking about the conceptual and the logical, we have to explicate what they mean by this in terms of the formal intuitive properties of cognition. And this just looks like it can't be the right approach. This means, I think, discursive numerosity just is an untenable thesis, and by extension that the mathematical alien couldn't discriminate collections of particulars, relations between those collections, and permutation invariant connections between them. And so they won't be able to distinguish universal particular judgments in the way that the objectualist frames the distinction. And so I think objectualism just cannot be the right view. So that, just to be clear, that they can't be the right view about Kant's conception of logical quantity, but by extension, it also can't be the right view about Kant's conception of logic. So this leaves us with, I think, the original puzzle, but even more pronounced. We now know that the inclusion of logical quantities within a table of judgments needs to be explained. It needs to be explained in terms of what Kant means by saying logic is formal and abstract. But it's also just really hard to see how we can do that satisfactorily, given that Kant makes such a strict distinction between the quantificational in the mathematical context and whatever is going on here. So it may seem like a depressing, very negative conclusion, but I think it's a really important and interesting insight that Kant's conception of logic and his conception of logical quantity is so unlike our own. So whatever we come up with, it has to be quite surprising and quite different. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the joint session.